February 23, 1945. Hill 362, Iwo Jima. Corporal Hershel Woody Williams crawled forward with 70 pounds of steel, fuel, and compressed gas strapped to his back. Through the smoke and volcanic ash, he could see what remained of his demolition unit. All 6 members were dead or wounded. 4 riflemen provided covering fire. The concrete pillbox ahead had stopped 3 Marine companies cold. Inside Williams' flamethrower tanks, approximately 4 gallons of diesel and aviation fuel mixture waited. He had maybe 7 seconds of burn time. 7 seconds to expose himself completely. 7 seconds during which Japanese machine gunners would have a clear target marked by brilliant orange flame. Williams knew the mathematics. Every flamethrower operator deployed to Iwo Jima understood them. Out of over 300 operators who would land on this island, fewer than 20 would survive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The casualty rate approached 93%. Not wounded, dead or so catastrophically injured they would never return to combat. This is the story of how a farm boy from West Virginia, initially rejected by the Marines for being too short, became the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. This is the story of 4 hours on a volcanic island where one man, armed with liquid fire, destroyed 7 fortified positions that had killed dozens of Marines. And this is the story of a weapon so effective and so deadly that using it meant accepting near certain death. But Williams's story did not begin on Iwo Jima. It began years earlier, in a place where the only fire he knew came from wood stoves and kerosene lamps. October 2nd, 1923. Quiet Dell, West Virginia. Hershel Woodrow Williams entered the world, weighing 3.5 pounds. The doctor who travelled several miles to reach the remote dairy farm did not expect the infant to survive. Williams's mother, Lorena, named him after that doctor, a gesture of gratitude for arriving when most would not have bothered for such a small, unlikely life. The farm sat in Marion County, southeast of Fairmont, in hill country where families worked land that never quite yielded enough. The Williams family understood poverty with an intimacy that shaped every decision, every meal, every worn-out pair of boots passed from one child to the next. Hershel was the youngest of 11 children. Only 5 reached adulthood. The 1918 influenza pandemic had torn through the family years before Hershel's birth. His mother had buried children before they learned to walk. His father, Lloyd, would die of a heart attack when Hershel was 11, leaving the family even more vulnerable to the depression that was strangling rural America. Money was not scarce on the Williams farm. It was non-existent. A full day's labour might earn 10 cents, if work could be found at all. The family ate what they grew, wore what they could mend, and understood that survival meant everyone contributed. Hershel's mornings began in darkness. Before elementary school in the one-room schoolhouse, he would bring the cows in from pasture. His portion of the milking had to be finished by hand before dawn. The work was not punishment. It was simply life. Everyone had their share. Everyone did what needed doing. The schoolhouse taught reading and arithmetic to children of all ages in one room. Hershel learned what he could, but the 7-mile distance between home and high school presented a problem the family could not solve. Sometimes he walked. Sometimes he found a ride. Often, neither was possible. He dropped out during his freshman year, not from lack of interest or ability, but from simple mathematics. 7 miles was too far. The family needed him at home. Education was a luxury they could not afford. After leaving school, Hershel followed a brother into the Civilian Conservation Corps, a Depression-era work relief program that put young men to work on public lands. The CCC paid $30 per month, 25 of which went directly to the worker's family. For the Williams family, those $25 represented more cash than they might see in months of farm work. Hershel expected to remain in West Virginia, working forests and trails near home. Instead, the CCC sent him to Montana, packing him off to mountains and plains he had never imagined seeing. He was there, far from West Virginia, when radio reports interrupted normal programming on December 7, 1941. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Hershel Williams was 18 years old, working in Montana, sending money home to his mother. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed his entire generation overnight. Young men across America lined up at recruiting stations. Some sought revenge, some sought adventure. Some, like Williams, sought a way to protect what they valued most: home, family, the freedom to work a dairy farm in the hills of West Virginia without foreign interference. Williams made his decision quickly. He would join the Marines. The United States Marine Corps represented the elite fighting force of American military power. Marines hit beaches first. Marines faced the worst fighting. Marines demanded the highest standards. But when Hershel Williams presented himself at the recruiting station, the Marines rejected him. He was too short. The minimum height requirement was 5 feet 8 inches. Williams stood 5 feet 6 inches. 2 inches separated him from the uniform he wanted to wear. The rejection stung, but Williams was not easily discouraged. A man who had survived weighing 3.5 pounds at birth, who had worked dairy farms in all weather, who had left home as a teenager to send money back to his family, understood that obstacles existed to be overcome. He returned home and waited. The war expanded. The Marines needed men. Casualties mounted in the Pacific as Japanese forces proved far more formidable than American planners had expected. The minimum height requirement was dropped. In early 1943, Williams returned to the recruiting station. This time, they accepted him. At 19 years old, he raised his right hand and swore an oath to defend the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He had no idea what that oath would demand of him. Boot camp at Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego broke down civilians and rebuilt them as Marines. The training was deliberately brutal, designed to weed out anyone who lacked the physical stamina or mental toughness for combat. Williams, hardened by years of farm labor, handled the physical demands better than recruits from cities who had never done manual labor. The drill instructors screamed. They cursed. They pushed recruits to exhaustion and then pushed further. Some recruits washed out, unable to handle the pressure. Williams persisted. He had milked cows in winter darkness. He had worked all day for 10 cents. He had walked 7 miles to high school until poverty forced him to quit. Boot camp was hard, but nothing he faced in San Diego approached the grinding poverty of Depression-era Appalachia. Marksmanship training revealed an unexpected talent. Williams had never fired a weapon before joining the Marines. The Williams family could not afford guns or ammunition, but the patience required to milk cows by hand, the steady rhythm of farm work, translated to steady hands on the rifle range. He qualified expert. After boot camp, Williams received orders for tank battalion training. The Marine Corps assigned personnel based on aptitude tests, physical characteristics, and unit needs. Williams learned the basics of armored warfare, maintenance, crew coordination. Then, without explanation, the orders changed. Williams was transferred to demolition training. He would learn to destroy fortified positions using explosives and specialized weapons. He would learn to operate the M2 Flamethrower. The training took place at Camp Lejeune. The instructors were Marines who had already fought in the Pacific. They understood what worked and what got men killed. Their lessons were technical, detailed, and brutally honest about survival odds. The M2 Flamethrower consisted of 3 cylindrical tanks mounted in a backpack configuration. 2 larger tanks held approximately 4 gallons of fuel, a carefully engineered mixture of diesel oil and high-octane aviation gasoline. Between these fuel tanks sat a smaller cylinder containing compressed nitrogen, the propellant that would force the fuel mixture through the system at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. A flexible rubber hose connected the backpack to the firing wand, essentially a metal tube with a pistol grip and 2 triggers. The rear trigger released nitrogen pressure, forcing fuel through the system. The front trigger activated a cartridge-based ignition system, 5 igniter cartridges arranged in a revolver configuration that provided reliable spark ignition even under combat conditions. When fully loaded with fuel and propellant, the M2 weighed 70 pounds. The weapon had an effective range of approximately 20 meters, though under ideal conditions the flame could reach 40 meters. But effectiveness and range were measured in ideal circumstances, and combat provided nothing ideal. The total burn time was 7 to 8 seconds of continuous fire, though operators learned quickly to fire in short bursts to maximize their limited fuel supply. Each burst consumed roughly half a gallon per second, creating a roaring fireball of diesel-fueled flame that could penetrate bunker openings, flow into cave systems, and most critically, consume the oxygen needed for human survival within enclosed spaces. The weapon killed not just through burns, but through asphyxiation, turning Japanese defensive positions into ovens that baked their occupants alive, or suffocated them when the flames consumed all available air. Williams would later say the training was technical, focused on the flamethrower's design and mechanics. There was little instruction on operational use. The trainers taught how to prime the ignition system, how to maintain proper nitrogen pressure, how to detect fuel leaks that could turn the operator into a human torch. They taught the specific stance required to fire, leaning forward to counteract the weapon's significant recoil when compressed nitrogen exploded through the system. But learning to use the weapon under fire, learning to survive while carrying 70 pounds of explosives on your back, that knowledge had to be earned in combat. Williams could not count the number of times he singed off his eyebrows and arm hair learning to control the weapon. The propellant's force created substantial kick when fired. Unless the operator braced properly and leaned into the discharge, the barrel could point skyward, raining burning fuel down onto the operator himself. Williams witnessed one Marine, untrained but desperate, pick up a fallen flamethrower and fire it without proper stance. The man was saturated with flame and killed instantly. The image burned into Williams' memory, a reminder that the weapon demanded respect and technical proficiency. Courage alone would not keep you alive. The instructors emphasized that flamethrower operators never worked alone. Standard doctrine called for a 4 to 6 man fire team. The flamethrower operator, an assistant carrying extra fuel cylinders and ignition cartridges, and at least 2 riflemen, preferably with Browning automatic rifles, whose job was to provide suppressing fire as the flamethrower team approached enemy positions. In theory, the riflemen would pin down Japanese defenders, while the flamethrower got close enough to engage. The assistant would help the operator reload or take over if the primary operator was hit. It was sound, tactical doctrine. On Iwo Jima, it rarely worked as planned. In October 1943, Williams was assigned to the 32nd Replacement Battalion and left for New Caledonia, in the Southwest Pacific, aboard the MS Welty Redden. In January 1944, he joined Company C, 1st Battalion, 21st Marine Regiment, 3rd Marine Division at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal had been secured by American forces after months of brutal fighting. By the time Williams arrived, the island served as a staging area, a place where replacement troops joined veteran units preparing for the next operation. Williams trained in the oppressive heat and humidity, learning jungle warfare tactics, adjusting to the environment that would define Pacific combat. His first taste of combat came in July and August 1944 during the Battle of Guam. Williams was attached to Headquarters Company for the operation. Guam had been American territory before the war, captured by Japan in the opening days of the conflict. Retaking it held both strategic and symbolic importance. The landing beaches were heavily defended. Naval bombardment and airstrikes had pounded Japanese positions for days before the amphibious assault, but as Marines would learn throughout the Pacific campaign, bombardment rarely destroyed well-constructed defensive positions. It merely drove defenders underground until the shelling stopped. Williams landed with his flamethrower. He crawled forward toward a pillbox, volcanic terrain providing minimal cover. Japanese machine gun fire ricocheted off his tanks. The thick steel held. He got close enough to engage, rolling a ball of flame into the pillbox entrance. The sensation was unlike anything training had prepared him for. The heat, the noise, the knowledge that men were dying inside the position he was burning. Williams had killed his first enemy soldiers, not at a distance with a rifle, but up close, with fire that consumed them alive. He recalled one lesson learned in combat that no training could teach. He strapped a flamethrower on his back and started crawling toward pillboxes. He remembered bullets ricocheting off his tanks. The sound was distinctive, metallic impacts that signaled how close he had come to catastrophic failure. A punctured fuel tank while flame was present meant instant immolation. After Guam, Williams returned to his unit, and the 3rd Marine Division continued training. In October, he rejoined Company C. The division was preparing for another operation, though the destination remained classified. Rumors circulated. Some thought Formosa, others guessed the Philippines. The truth, when it came during classified briefings in late 1944, proved more daunting than any rumor. The 3rd Marine Division, along with the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, would assault Iwo Jima, a volcanic island roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo. Intelligence officers displayed aerial photographs. The island measured approximately 5 miles long and 2.5 miles at its widest point, dominated by Mount Suribachi on the southern tip. The briefings explained strategic necessity. American B-29 Superfortress bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan operated at the extreme edge of their range. Damaged bombers often ditched in the ocean during the return flight, losing entire crews. Iwo Jima would provide an emergency landing strip. The island could also base fighter escorts for the bombers, dramatically improving survival rates against Japanese air defenses. Intelligence estimates predicted 1 week to secure the island. The briefers displayed confidence. The Japanese garrison was estimated at around 13,000 troops. 3 Marine divisions, approximately 70,000 Marines, would overwhelm them through superior firepower and amphibious assault expertise. What the intelligence officers did not know, what they could not know from aerial reconnaissance, was the sophistication of Japanese defensive preparations. They did not know about the 18 kilometers of tunnels carved into volcanic rock. They did not know about the hundreds of reinforced concrete pillboxes, each positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. They did not know about Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's revolutionary defensive doctrine that rejected traditional Japanese tactics in favor of defense in depth and calculated attrition. Most critically for Williams and every other flamethrower operator preparing to land on Iwo Jima, intelligence did not accurately predict the casualties their specific role would demand. The 93% casualty rate among flamethrower operators was not yet calculated. That number would be written in blood and volcanic ash over 36 days of the most brutal fighting in Marine Corps history. The architect of Iwo Jima's defenses understood exactly what he faced. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi came from samurai lineage and had spent time in the United States during the 1920s, training with cavalry units at Fort Bliss, Texas. Unlike many Japanese commanders who viewed Americans as soft and undisciplined, Kuribayashi understood American industrial capacity and military capability. He had written to his wife years earlier that the United States was the last country Japan should fight, describing American industrial capacity as huge and fabulous, the people as energetic and versatile. He knew American fighting ability should never be underestimated. When Prime Minister Hideki Tojo personally assigned Kuribayashi to defend Iwo Jima in May 1944, the general understood he could not win. Japan had already lost the war. American industrial production, military strength, and technological superiority made Japanese defeat inevitable. But the timing and terms of that defeat remained in question. Kuribayashi's mission was not victory, it was delay, not to defend Iwo Jima successfully, but to make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they might reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. He approached this mission with cold calculation and innovative defensive doctrine. Traditional Japanese defensive strategy called for fighting at the water's edge, meeting invaders on the beaches and destroying them before they could establish a foothold. This approach had achieved some success in earlier campaigns, but had proven increasingly ineffective against American amphibious capability. Kuribayashi abandoned this traditional approach entirely. He ordered his 21,000 troops to dig in, to burrow into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock, to create an underground fortress that could withstand even the heaviest bombardment. His men excavated 18 kilometers of tunnels, creating an interconnected network of fighting positions, supply depots, and command posts. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They constructed hundreds of concealed pillboxes using reinforced concrete and volcanic rock. These positions were masterfully camouflaged, invisible from the air and nearly invisible from ground level until Marines were almost on top of them. Each position was sited to provide interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that attackers who neutralized one position would immediately be engaged by others. Artillery and mortar positions were constructed in caves and covered bunkers, allowing Japanese gunners to fire on pre-arranged targets, then retreat into cover before counter-battery fire could respond. Pre-registered firing points covered every likely avenue of approach, every beach, every terrain feature that attacking forces might use for cover. Kuribayashi trained his men in a new defensive doctrine that rejected the banzai charges and suicidal attacks that had characterized earlier Japanese resistance. There would be no wasteful gestures of honor, no dramatic but tactically meaningless attacks. Every man would fight from cover, fire only when targets presented themselves, inflict maximum casualties, while preserving their own lives as long as possible. Each defender was instructed to kill 10 Americans before dying himself. Positions would be defended to the last man, but defenders would not throw away their lives in useless attacks. They would make the Americans dig them out, one position at a time, paying in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. The discipline required to implement this doctrine was extraordinary. Traditional Japanese military culture emphasized aggressive offensive action, glorious death in battle, and honor through sacrifice. Kuribayashi was asking his men to abandon these deeply ingrained values, to accept that they would all die, but to die in ways that maximized enemy casualties rather than personal glory. That he succeeded in imposing this discipline on his command speaks to both his leadership ability and the desperate circumstances Japan faced by early 1945. The men defending Iwo Jima understood they were doomed, that no reinforcement would come, that the best they could hope for was to die in ways that served Japan's final defense. The pre-invasion bombardment began on February 16, 1945. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the Marine Forces, had requested 10 days of naval bombardment based on intelligence estimates of Japanese defensive strength. He understood from bitter experience that reducing fortified positions required sustained fire over days, not hours. The Navy provided 3 days. This decision reflected both the strategic demands of the broader Pacific campaign and fundamental misunderstanding of the defensive preparations on Iwo Jima. Naval planners believed that 3 days of concentrated fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would be sufficient to neutralize defensive positions and suppress remaining resistance. For 72 hours, the most powerful naval task force ever assembled pounded Iwo Jima. Battleships firing 16-inch guns hurled shells, weighing more than a ton into volcanic rock. Cruisers added 8-inch fire. Destroyers maneuvered close inshore to engage specific targets with 5-inch guns. The bombardment was staggering in scale. Thousands of shells crashed into the island every hour. Entire sections of terrain disappeared under explosions. Volcanic rock shattered and sprayed across the landscape. From the transport ships where Marines waited, the island seemed to be disintegrating under the weight of fire. B-29 bombers flew strikes from the Marianas, adding heavy bombs to the naval gunfire. Navy aircraft from fast carriers attacked systematically, bombing and strafing any visible targets. The combined firepower represented the most concentrated bombardment yet delivered against a Pacific island. The Marines watching from their transports felt confident. Nothing could survive that bombardment. Intelligence estimates predicted 1 week to secure the island. A few officers privately speculated they might wrap up operations in 3 or 4 days. They were catastrophically wrong. The bombardment, while visually impressive, was largely ineffective against Kuribayashi's underground fortress. Naval shells designed to penetrate ship armor or destroy surface structures had limited effect on positions dug deep into volcanic rock. Bombs created impressive craters but failed to collapse the tunnel networks beneath. The Japanese, following Kuribayashi's orders, remained in their underground positions throughout the bombardment. They did not return fire, did not reveal their positions, did not give the American gunners any targets to engage. The Americans were in many cases bombarding empty terrain, while the actual defensive positions remained untouched deep underground. When the bombardment lifted on the morning of February 19th, Kuribayashi's forces emerged from their tunnels largely intact, weapons functional, ammunition stocks undepleted, defensive positions still viable. The 3 days of bombardment had accomplished little beyond alerting the defenders that the invasion was imminent. February 19th, 1945, dawned clear and cold. Hour was set for 900 hours. The 1st Assault Wave, 5th Marine Division on the left, 4th Marine Division on the right, would land across 700 yards of beach designated Green Beach, Red Beach, Yellow Beach, and Blue Beach from south to north. Williams was with the 3rd Marine Division, held in reserve for the initial landing. He would not hit the beach until February 21st, but from the transport ship he could watch the assault waves churn toward shore in their Amtraks, carrying their loads of Marines toward an island that would consume more Marine blood than any battle in Corps history. The first wave hit the beach at precisely 900 hours. Marines immediately encountered an obstacle that aerial reconnaissance had not fully appreciated. The beach was not sand in the traditional sense, but volcanic ash, black and loose, rising in terraces 15 feet high. Men sank to their ankles with every step. Some sank to their knees. The volcanic ash provided no stable footing, no firm surface for digging in or establishing firing positions. Vehicles bogged down immediately. Tanks and Amtraks that attempted to climb the beach terraces found their treads spinning uselessly in the loose ash. Equipment that was supposed to move inland to support the advancing infantry became stuck within yards of the waterline. Marines attempting to dig foxholes found the loose ash collapsing back into any hole they scraped. The volcanic debris was so fine it clogged weapons, jammed mechanical systems, and infiltrated every piece of equipment. And for the first hour, there was almost no enemy fire. The silence continued, broken only by the sound of naval gunfire falling inland and the laboured breathing of men struggling through volcanic ash. Officers checked their watches nervously. The lack of resistance felt wrong, ominous. Kuribayashi's plan was unfolding perfectly. He let the Marines land. He let them struggle up the beaches, let them bunch together as follow-on waves arrived and congested the landing areas. He waited until approximately 30,000 Marines were ashore, packed into a beachhead barely 1,000 yards deep. Then he opened fire. At approximately 1000 hours, when the beach was crowded with men and vehicles, when Marines were struggling through the ash, unable to advance quickly or take effective cover, when thousands of Americans were packed into the confined space between the waterline and the first terrace, the entire island erupted. Artillery and mortar fire fell in devastating concentrations, pre-registered fires that had been plotted weeks in advance. High explosive shells burst among the packed Marines, sending fragments tearing through flesh and equipment. Mortar rounds dropped into the volcanic ash with dull crunches before exploding. Machine guns fired from hidden positions in the terraces, from concealed pillboxes, from firing ports so skillfully camouflaged that Marines could not locate them even while taking fire. The interlocking fields of fire that Kuribayashi had so carefully planned meant that attackers who sought cover from one position immediately exposed themselves to fire from another. Marines died in the black volcanic sand, cut down by fire they could not see, from positions they could not locate, delivered by an enemy that remained invisible. Men tried to dig in, but the loose volcanic ash collapsed faster than they could excavate. Wounded Marines sank into the ash, sometimes disappearing entirely. Corpsmen trying to treat casualties became casualties themselves. Officers attempting to organize advances were cut down by machine gun fire. The pre-invasion bombardment, which was supposed to have neutralized defensive positions, had barely scratched Kuribayashi's defenses. By nightfall on D-Day, the Marines had carved out precarious footholds, but at a cost of over 519 killed in action and over 2,400 total casualties. And this was just the beginning. Ahead lay 36 days of the most brutal close-quarters combat in Marine Corps history. Williams would land on February 21st with the 3rd Marine Division. His job title was Demolition Sergeant, but his primary weapon was the M2 Flamethrower. He supervised what should have been a 6-man flamethrower demolition unit, specialists trained to approach and destroy fortified positions using a combination of explosives and liquid fire. By the time Williams reached Iwo Jima, he had already seen combat on Guam. He understood how effective and how dangerous the flamethrower could be against Japanese fortifications. But nothing on Guam prepared him for Iwo Jima. The 21st Marines, Williams' regiment, had orders to drive across the island's narrowest point, cutting Japanese forces in two, and preventing reinforcement or coordination between northern and southern defensive sectors. It was a critical mission that would require fighting through some of the most heavily fortified terrain on the island. The volcanic ash that hindered movement on D-Day remained a constant obstacle. Every step required extra effort. The ash got into everything. Weapons required constant cleaning. Equipment malfunctioned. The fine black powder infiltrated food, water, medical supplies. The Japanese defensive network meant that every advance came under fire from multiple directions. Pillboxes that appeared isolated turned out to be connected by tunnels to other positions. Marines would assault and clear a position, only to have it reoccupied overnight as Japanese troops moved through underground passages. The Marine doctrine for using flamethrowers was straightforward in theory. When Marines encountered a fortified position that stopped their advance, they would call up a flamethrower team. Riflemen, typically armed with M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles, would establish a base of fire, pouring suppressing fire into the target pillbox or cave entrance to keep defenders from exposing themselves. Under this covering fire, the flamethrower operator, accompanied by his assistant and perhaps additional riflemen, would advance as close as possible to the target. Ideally, the operator wanted to be within 20 meters, the weapon's effective range. Then he would engage, firing burst after burst of flaming fuel into the opening until he had exhausted his fuel supply or the target was neutralized. Reality on Iwo Jima deviated catastrophically from this doctrine. The Japanese defensive network meant that Marines could not suppress one position without being fired upon from others. The interlocking fields of fire made it nearly impossible to approach any single pillbox safely. Japanese snipers positioned in elevated locations throughout the defensive zone specifically targeted flamethrower operators. The bright orange flame, visible for hundreds of meters, acted as a beacon. Once an operator fired his weapon, every Japanese soldier in the vicinity knew exactly where he was. The operator could not move quickly while firing. The weapon's weight, the need to aim carefully, and the resistance of the hose connecting the backpack to the firing wand all slowed movement. The operator was essentially stationary while engaging a target, presenting an ideal target for counterfire. The backpack itself was a vulnerability. Though the tanks were thick steel, reportedly bulletproof under most circumstances, they were not invulnerable. A direct hit from a larger caliber weapon could puncture a tank. The nitrogen tank, under 300 pounds of pressure, could rupture from concussion or shrapnel. If the nitrogen tank ruptured while the operator was firing, the sudden loss of pressure could cause a violent blowback. If a fuel tank was punctured while the operator was firing and flame was already present, the result was immediate immolation. Japanese soldiers understood this and aimed accordingly. The psychological burden was immense. Flamethrower operators were priority targets. The moment they engaged, they would draw fire from every enemy soldier who could see them. Their chances of survival decreased with every mission. The nature of their weapon made surrender impossible. Japanese soldiers who saw flamethrower operators approaching their positions understood they faced death by fire. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose. Some would attempt to bayonet charge the operator before he could engage. Others would hold their fire until the operator was completely vulnerable, then open up with everything they had. For Williams and every other flamethrower operator on Iwo Jima, The mathematics were inescapable. Every time they picked up the weapon, every time they advanced toward an enemy position, they were rolling dice weighted heavily against survival. The question was not whether they would become casualties. The question was how many enemy positions they could destroy before the odds caught up with them. February 23, 1945, was the day the odds should have caught Williams. It was the same day Marines raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi. It was the day captured in Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph. It was also the day Woody Williams earned the Medal of Honor and, against all statistical probability, survived. Williams' company had been attempting to cross one of the island's 2 operational airfields, but was pinned down by intense fire from multiple Japanese pillboxes. 3 companies had already tried to advance across the open ground. All had been stopped cold with heavy casualties. Marine tanks had attempted to support the advance, but were knocked out or driven back by Japanese anti-tank guns and artillery. The battalion commander called a meeting in a shell crater to avoid Japanese observation. He asked Williams, as the only flamethrower and demolition expert still operational, if he would take on the pillboxes. Williams knew what the question meant. All the other members of his flamethrower demolition unit were already casualties. He would be working essentially alone, but he also knew that without those pillboxes neutralized, his entire company would remain pinned down, taking casualties from machine gun and artillery fire, with no way to advance or retreat safely. He selected 4 riflemen to provide covering fire. Their job was nearly impossible. They had to suppress Japanese positions while Williams moved within effective range. 2 of those 4 riflemen would not survive the afternoon. What followed was later described in Williams's Medal of Honor citation as 4 hours of the most conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Williams crawled forward toward the first pillbox, his 70-pound flamethrower dragging through volcanic ash. Bullets from Japanese machine guns ricocheted off his tanks. The thick steel held. He got within 25 yards and rolled a massive ball of flame into the pillbox entrance, silencing the position. He crawled to the next position, spotted a wisp of smoke escaping from a ventilation hole in the reinforced concrete roof, climbed on top of the fortification, and fired the flamethrower nozzle directly into the vent, killing everyone inside. Over 4 hours, Williams returned to his own lines 5 separate times to refill his flamethrower tanks and obtain fresh ignition cartridges. 5 times he moved back into the open under fire to engage more positions. During one approach, he faced Japanese soldiers charging him with bayonets, attempting to kill him before he could fire. Williams engaged them with flame from point-blank range. The flamethrower consumed all available oxygen as it created the fireball, asphyxiating the charging soldiers instantly. At another point, Williams found himself under fire from 3 directions simultaneously. He had no choice but to continue moving forward, as stopping would mean certain death. The covering fire from his 4 riflemen, depleted to 3, then 2 as casualties mounted, barely kept Japanese defenders suppressed long enough for Williams to engage each position. When it was over, Williams had single-handedly destroyed 7 major pillboxes that had stopped 3 Marine companies cold. He had used dozens of gallons of flamethrower fuel. He had survived injuries that would earn him a Purple Heart, and he had demonstrated why flamethrower operators, despite the 93% casualty rate, were considered the most valuable specialists on Iwo Jima. The citation that would accompany his Medal of Honor detailed the action. Quick to volunteer his services when our tanks were maneuvering vainly to open a lane for the infantry through the network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, buried mines, and black volcanic sands, Corporal Williams daringly went forward alone to attempt the reduction of devastating machine gun fire from the unyielding positions. Covered only by 4 riflemen, he fought desperately for 4 hours under terrific enemy small arms fire and repeatedly returned to his own lines to prepare demolition charges and obtain serviced flamethrowers, struggling back, frequently to the rear of hostile emplacements, to wipe out one position after another. On one occasion, he daringly mounted a pillbox to insert the nozzle of his flamethrower through the air vent, killing the occupants and silencing the gun. On another, He grimly charged enemy riflemen who attempted to stop him with bayonets and destroyed them with a burst of flame from his weapon. His unyielding determination and extraordinary heroism in the face of ruthless enemy resistance were directly instrumental in neutralizing one of the most fanatically defended Japanese strong points encountered by his regiment, and aided vitally in enabling his company to reach its objective. Corporal Williams' aggressive fighting spirit and valiant devotion to duty throughout this fiercely contested action sustain and enhance the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The words were formal, military, appropriate for official documentation. They could not capture the terror of those 4 hours. They could not describe the sensation of crawling through volcanic ash while machine gun fire ricocheted off steel tanks filled with explosive fuel. They could not convey the weight of knowing that every other member of your unit was dead or wounded, that you were alone, that survival was statistically impossible. Williams would later say that much of those 4 hours existed in his memory as a blur. He attributed that to fear, because to say he was not scared would be the biggest lie ever told. You go into automatic drive when something like that happens. The body moves, the training takes over, the conscious mind retreats to somewhere safer, leaving muscle memory and survival instinct to navigate hell. But some moments remained vivid. The sound of bullets striking his tanks, the heat of the flame rolling back toward him, the faces of Japanese soldiers in the instant before flame consumed them, the weight of the flamethrower growing heavier with each trip back to reload, the knowledge that his 4 riflemen were dying to keep him alive. Williams fought through the remainder of the 36-day battle. On March 6th, he was wounded in the leg by fragmentation. The injury earned him a Purple Heart but was not severe enough to warrant evacuation. He continued fighting. Out of over 300 flamethrower operators deployed by the American military on Iwo Jima, Williams was one of fewer than 20 to survive. The 93% casualty rate was not an estimate. It was an exact count, a statistical reality measured in bodies that could not be identified because fire left nothing to identify, in men who simply disappeared into volcanic ash, in operators who survived physically but carried psychological wounds that would never heal. The battle officially ended on March 26, 1945, though isolated pockets of resistance continued for days afterward. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their tunnels and pillboxes, fighting to the last as Kuribayashi had ordered. Kuribayashi himself was never found. His body was lost among the thousands of Japanese dead. Most historians believe he died in the final days of fighting, probably leading a small counterattack or defending one of the last command posts. His strategy of defense in depth, attrition warfare, and refusal to waste men in banzai charges had worked exactly as intended. He made America bleed. American casualties were staggering. The 3 Marine divisions suffered 6,821 killed in action or missing and presumed dead. Another 19,217 were wounded. More than 800 Americans died for every square mile of Iwo Jima's volcanic sand. The casualty rate approached 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima became a casualty. Some units suffered much higher rates. The 21st Marines, Williams' regiment, was decimated. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. 12 of these were for actions involving the elimination of enemy positions, the kind of close-quarters fighting where flamethrowers proved essential. Only 6 of those 12 recipients survived to receive their medals. The others died in the actions for which they were recognized. Williams received his Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in October 1945, 7 months after his heroic actions. The ceremony took place at the White House. 14 servicemen received the nation's highest decoration that day. Williams stood among them, a farm boy from West Virginia who had been rejected by the Marines for being too short, now wearing the Medal of Honor around his neck. For decades after the war, Williams struggled with what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares came regularly, the faces of men he had killed, the screams of Japanese soldiers dying in flame, the memories of friends who died beside him, the weight of survival when so many others had not survived. It was not until 1962, when Williams experienced a religious renewal, that his nightmares finally ended. He described it as putting memories in the recess of his mind, acknowledging that any time you take a life, there is aftermath if you have any heart at all. The psychological burden of flamethrower killing was particularly haunting. Riflemen could sometimes distance themselves psychologically from their victims. Artillery crews might never see the effects of their fire, but flamethrower operators saw everything. They heard the screams. They smelled burning flesh. They witnessed enemies attempting to escape the flames, engulfed in fire, thrashing until death provided release. Williams spent the rest of his life working with veterans organizations, establishing the Hershel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation, and speaking about the costs of war. He traveled back to Iwo Jima dozens of times, participating in reunions of honor where American and Japanese veterans met, former enemies now elderly and reflective. At one such reunion, Williams spoke about how Americans came to Iwo Jima as enemies but left as students, having learned profound lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the costs of war. He met Japanese veterans who remembered the battle from the other side, men who had survived Kuribayashi's underground fortress, who had fired on American Marines, who had watched their comrades die in the tunnels. These meetings were emotional, difficult, and ultimately healing. Former enemies could acknowledge each other's courage without celebrating the war that had brought them together. They could honor the dead without glorifying the killing. They could remember without hatred. Williams was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II when he died on June 29, 2022, at the age of 98. His death marked the end of an era. The generation that fought World War II, the men and women who sacrificed everything to defeat fascism, was disappearing. Soon, there would be no one left who remembered, who had seen, who had survived. His funeral was held at the Hershel Woody Williams Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Huntington, West Virginia, a facility named in his honor. On July 14, 2022, Williams's remains lay in honor at the United States Capitol Rotunda, one of the highest tributes the nation can bestow. The question that haunted Williams throughout his life, the question that haunts anyone who learns his story, is simple and unanswerable. Why did he survive when 280 others did not? Was it luck? The random chance that determined which bullets found their mark and which ricocheted harmlessly off steel tanks? Was it skill? The countless hours of training? The patience learned milking cows by hand? The steady rhythm that translated to weapon control under fire? Was it divine intervention? Williams himself came to believe his survival served a purpose, that he was spared to tell the story, to honor the dead, to ensure their sacrifice was remembered. Or was it simply statistics? 300 operators, 93% casualties, 20 survived. Someone had to be in that 7%. Williams happened to be one of them. The truth is, probably all of these factors and none of them. Combat operates by rules that defy easy explanation. Men who take every precaution die in the first seconds of battle. Men who expose themselves recklessly survive unscathed. Courage does not guarantee survival. Caution does not prevent death. What can be said with certainty is that Williams did everything right. He trained thoroughly. He fought intelligently. He accepted risk when the mission demanded it. He returned to reload when others might have hidden in cover. He advanced when every survival instinct screamed to retreat. He did his job, as he would later say, not thinking he had done anything special. But it was special. Walking into fire, knowing you probably will not walk out, and doing it anyway because your brothers need you. That is the definition of courage. Returning 5 times to reload when each trip meant exposing yourself to the same deadly fire, that is the definition of duty. Destroying 7 fortified positions that had killed dozens of Marines, that is the definition of heroism. The flamethrower operators of Iwo Jima were volunteers and draftees, farm boys and city kids, college students and factory workers. They were ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They trained for weeks to master a weapon that would likely kill them. They advanced into fire and steel, carrying 70 pounds of fuel and explosives on their backs, marked by brilliant orange flame, to destroy positions that threatened their comrades. And 93% of them became casualties in the process. The mathematics were brutal. The mission demanded it. The weapon was too effective, too essential to the Marines' ability to reduce Japanese fortifications. Someone had to carry the fire. Someone had to accept the risk. The operators understood the odds and picked up the weapons anyway. Williams survived. 280 others did not. Their names are inscribed in stone at military cemeteries. Their bodies rest in graves marked and unmarked. Their stories are mostly forgotten, overshadowed by the more famous moments of the battle, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, the dramatic photographs that came to symbolize American resolve. But every flamethrower operator who died on Iwo Jima died doing the same thing Williams did. They advanced under fire. They engaged enemy positions. They exposed themselves to save their comrades. The only difference was luck, or fate, or the random mathematics of combat that determine who lives and who dies. Williams spent 77 years carrying the weight of survival. He honored the dead by telling their story. He worked with Gold Star families who had lost sons and daughters in subsequent wars. He established monuments across America to ensure that the sacrifice of military families would never be forgotten. The Woody Williams Foundation built Gold Star families' memorial monuments in communities across the United States. These monuments honor families who have lost loved ones in military service, acknowledging that sacrifice extends beyond the service member to parents, spouses, children, siblings who carry that loss for the rest of their lives. Williams understood this intimately. He had seen friends die beside him. He had watched flamethrower operators, men he had trained with, killed by the weapon they carried or the enemy fire they drew. He knew that every name on every memorial represented not just a service member, but a family whose lives were forever altered by that loss. When Williams died in 2022, the nation mourned the last living link to World War II Medal of Honor recipients. News coverage focused on his heroism, his 4 hours on Iwo Jima, his survival against impossible odds. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Hershel Woody Williams was not what he did in 4 hours on a volcanic island in 1945. The most remarkable thing was how he spent the 77 years afterward. He could have hidden from his memories, could have refused to speak about the war, could have let the psychological wounds consume him as they consumed so many veterans. Instead, he chose to honor the dead by remembering them. He chose to help other veterans by sharing his story. He chose to ensure that future generations understood the costs of war and the debt owed to those who pay those costs. Williams never claimed to be special. He always insisted he was just doing his job. He deflected praise, redirected attention to the men who did not survive. In his mind, the heroes were the 280 flamethrower operators who died. The heroes were the 4 riflemen who provided covering fire, 2 of whom were killed doing so. The heroes were the Marines who fought and died across 36 days of brutal combat. He was just the one who survived to tell their story. But there is heroism in survival too. Not the heroism of a single moment, a single action, a single day of combat. The heroism of carrying memories that would break most people. The heroism of waking each day with faces of the dead in your mind. The heroism of speaking to children and grandchildren about experiences that defy explanation. The heroism of living a life worthy of the survival you were granted when so many others were not. Hershel Woody Williams was a farm boy from West Virginia. He weighed 3.5 pounds at birth. He was too short to join the Marines. He dropped out of high school because his family needed him to work. He had never fired a weapon before boot camp. Nothing in his background suggested he would become a war hero, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the largest conflict in human history. But when his country called, he answered. When his brothers needed him, he advanced into fire. When survival seemed impossible, he persisted. And when he returned home, when the war ended, when he could have disappeared into anonymity, he chose to remember. To honor. To ensure that the sacrifice of those who did not survive would never be forgotten. That is the complete story of why 1 Marine survived when 280 flamethrower operators died on Iwo Jima. It is a story of courage and luck, skill and circumstance, training and survival instinct. It is a story of 4 hours that defined a life and 77 years spent honoring the dead. It is a story worth remembering, because Woody Williams was not special. He was ordinary, and that is exactly what makes his survival and his subsequent life so extraordinary. He was one of us. A farm boy who did what needed doing. A Marine who picked up a weapon that meant probable death and used it to save his brothers. A survivor who spent the rest of his life ensuring we would never forget those who did not survive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.